Let's be honest. Donald Trump is old. He's 77. Joe Biden is even older. He's 81. 81. Americans tend to talk about Biden's age a fair bit. Trump's less so, but what they largely overlook is that a lot of American politicians are older than the rest of us. If you want to think about the most powerful Republican in Washington, he's Senator Mitch McConnell. He is 82. His counterpart, you could say, in the Senate, the most powerful Democrat there, is Chuck Schumer. He's 73. American politicians aren't all old, but by and large, they are older than the rest of us. And that's not an accident. The American political system has evolved to keep elderly people around. Joining us now to talk about that is the ever-youthful James Hensson of the Texas Politics Project. It's an amazing thing, isn't it? Because it just seems to be taken for granted. There's all these geezers running around in Washington.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're in a moment where people are painfully aware of that, from the observers down to the voters. Um, and I think it's become one of the more prominent issues in this election. I think more so in recent memory. I think certainly since Ronald Reagan ran for president in 1980.
I just really want to make the point. It's not just at the presidential level. A few months ago, Dianne Feinstein, Senator of California, died at age 90, still very much a senator. She was in a wheelchair. She wasn't entirely lucid, but on her good days, they would roll her into Washington and she would presumably go to work, encouraged to stay in office by her close friend, Nancy Pelosi, who at age 84 rather, is still a member of Congress and planning to run for re-election in November. I mean, it seems like the political class has gotten used to this.
Yeah, I think it's particularly endemic in the United States Congress, where you have a system in which incumbents enjoy such incredible advantages across the board, that somebody who has the will to stay and manages to avoid trouble, just has such a high probability of being reelected. And these are pretty good jobs, I would say, particularly in the U.S. Senate, which is smaller and also on average older. Once you're a U.S. senator, good gig. Why leave unless you have to?
Well, why don't they have to? I mean, what is it about being a U.S. senator that keeps you getting reelected year after year?
Well, I think you have to start with the fact that you've got a political system in the United States that, by and large, is controlled. The design of it is controlled by people whose self-interest is dominated by these rules. So the Constitution provides power to Congress, and then even more so to states and local governments, to make their own rules for elections and for voting. And these rules are, have to be fair on their surface, and there's a legal process, but the rules are written to protect incumbents, because it's the incumbents who write the rules in many cases.
So, what are your chances of staying in the U.S. Senate once you get in? I mean, how likely are you to be reelected?
It varies, across different periods, but if you're a U.S. senator and you're running for reelection, your chances of reelection are 80% or more in most cycles. And this is that makes this pretty great for the senators there.
So, the U.S. has essentially created a permanent governing class.
Well, I mean, I think there is some circulation, and I don't want to overstate the case too much. People make mistakes sometimes, and they're driven out, or, as we've seen very recently in the United States, and in an interesting way, we're seeing a handful of members this cycle quitting of their own accord. Um, Interestingly, for what we're discussing, many of the people quitting are not on the old side. They're people that have been there, in many cases, not very long, and are on the younger side, but are so frustrated with the way the process is working that they're deciding to quit early, essentially, or not run for reelection. But that's hardly an endorsement of the system. If what it takes for people to quit early is frustration and dissatisfaction with how institutions are working.
Well, those are people who made it in who are leaving. How hard is it for a newcomer to get in? How hard is it for new ideas to get in?
Well, it's very hard for challengers. I mean, it's ultimately the flip side of the statistic we mentioned earlier. If you've got incumbent success rates of 80, 85% or more in the US Congress, for example, that means that most of those challengers that try to displace those incumbents don't win. Incumbents have big advantages in knowing how to run and raising money and being able to use their office. And I think it's fair to say that that does throttle the entrance of new ideas into the political system, but I think it's also fair to say that the same dynamic also gives incumbents some measure of interest in keeping their ear to the ground and tracking new ideas. And that becomes part of that incumbent advantage. If you pick up that there's a new idea out there that you think may uh, help fuel a challenge to you, well, you have an incentive to try to run with that idea to prevent people from challenging you and taking your seat.
Well, I'm just curious about that because there are things that change. There are new events. There are new technologies. You talk about this group of powerful people trying to regulate a world where artificial intelligence and bioengineering are introducing ideas and opportunities and dangers that didn't exist 20 or 30 or 40 years ago. I mean, how do they grapple with these things?
Well, they grapple with them very slowly, and I think you put your finger on, a significant problem that we're facing in the present day, and that the political system has faced periodically as technological change has ebbed and flowed. And that is, the political system is designed in the United States to move slowly. I mean, this is supposed to be a feature, not a bug. Um, but as technological change happens more quickly and is harder to control, this initial feature of the political system, which was meant to prevent people taking over the political system and moving too quickly, has become more of an impediment to dealing with this ever more rapidly changing world.
There's another aspect to this, and I'm not sure if it's the cause or the effect, which is that ordinary voters of different age vote at different rates. And we have a slide about this. Young
Mhm.
people do turn out to vote, but only a fraction of them. And as people age, their propensity to vote grows, so that the oldest people in the country are the ones who are most likely to vote. And you kind of wonder, are older voters choosing older leaders because they feel represented, or are younger people staying home because how do you get a 22-year-old excited about voting for an 82-year-old?
Well, I think it's a fair observation to say that somebody who's 22 and somebody that's 82 don't have a lot in common, and maybe have a lot of trouble, particularly in this amidst all this rapid change, speaking the same language. That said, the low turnout rate among younger voters has been a long-term aspect of the system, and it doesn't necessarily seem that younger candidates correspond to increasing that turnout. But I think as things change more rapidly and depending on the conditions, and many of those conditions are present right now, like, economic problems that disproportionately affect young people. Um, there is an issue with whether, older voters, older office holders and candidates are somewhat alienating to younger voters. And I think people periodically, test that thesis, and we do see across, modern American history some cyclical, some cyclical changes here, and that every once in a while you get the sense that the electorate is tired of not only the same people but older people, and you see surges of support, for people like John Kennedy, but several decades ago, more recently Bill Clinton, but you don't necessarily see big increases in turnout among young voters during those elections.
You also see surges of support for the idea of limiting how long people can stay in office. It seems like term limits were something everyone was talking about a while ago. Even people coming into office promising term limits, promising they wouldn't stay and they would pass laws making it impossible for other people to stay. And yet that just seems to have dissipated. It went away.
Yeah, I mean, term limits is one of those ideas that's very interesting. It bubbles along out there, and there are people that often talk about term limits as candidates, and then the idea becomes less attractive after you win. And I think this speaks very much to point we were discussing earlier, that the people that are have the most leverage over the agenda on voting, elections, ideas like term limits are these incumbents that are involved in lawmaking. And frankly, there's a lot of evidence that this idea becomes much less attractive to people, to candidates, once they become incumbents.
I guess once you're in, you don't want to go.
Yeah, I mean, as we've said earlier, why would you, in a lot of ways? And look, I don't want to be 100% cynical about this. I mean, I think there is the basic self-interest, but there's also an idea that people that are elected, many of them, they feel once they're in office that they're getting something done, and they do, rightly or wrongly, come to feel like they're doing a good job, and want to stay and do that job.
Well, let me ask you. You feel like you're doing a good job, I guess. Could we have this conversation again, say 50 years from now?
Well, we're talking about technology. I think we could, maybe not you and I, but look, I don't see any sign that term limits or the underlying dynamics that we've been talking about are changing. I expect, all things being equal, this will be a fairly permanent feature of the system. Though I would say that at the presidential level, and even to some degree, perhaps in Congress, after this election, there's undoubtedly going to be an extended conversation about the age of candidates in the political system. Whether anybody can leverage that in any fundamental way, I think, is a bigger question that I'm a little more skeptical about.
James Henson of the Texas Politics Project. Thanks so much.